Fortune telling, predictions, and writing horoscopes. Is that what you do all day? Someone recently asked me. Now I assure you, an astrologer's work is way more interesting than that. So astrology is a very misunderstood profession, with most people knowing virtually nothing about what we actually do. So here's 6 things that you didn't know a properly skilled astrologer can do. Rectification. Western astrology charts are calculated for the exact minute of birth. And this makes it different from other forms of astrology, such as Chinese astrology that calculates charts down to, say, a 2-hour interval, and this is known as 时辰. But you see, charts that require exact birth times create problems because not everybody has the exact birth time. And obviously there are cases where, it's just people who are lazy to look for their birth charts, but we also have genuine cases such as people who are born in countries that don't record the birth times on the birth certificate. And you also get cases of people born during wartime or even refugees who may have been born without birth documentation. In fact, I personally have had a few clients with cases like these. So rectification can be done by a properly trained astrologer, but through a very tedious process involving both the astrologer and the client, asking questions, adjusting the birth chart just so that we eventually find the chart that would fit with all the important events that have happened so far in the client's life. Now, it is a difficult process, and it's not so difficult to do if the uncertain period is, say, within an hour or less. Sometimes you get a case of somebody saying that, it was between 6 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Now, that's not so difficult. But what's really tough is when somebody has totally no idea when their birth time is, just the birth date. That one is a nightmare to do. So how often do I actually do rectification? It really depends, but we do get a few genuine cases per year, very often from people who are born in countries who don't have the exact birth time. It is truly a tedious process, and you'll find that most astrologers charge extra for rectification work, depending on how long the uncertain range is. Horary. Horo is Greek for time, and a horary is a chart of the moment, much like right now. Now, horary happens to be a divination technique typically used for answering questions, very similarly to how people might ask questions of a tarot card reader or a variation of the Chinese I Ching. So horary is very often used to sort of determine the outcome of a situation or even to find missing objects. So I'm serious about this. It means if you lose your mobile phone, you could ask, where is my mobile phone? And at the moment, the horary chart explains not just the location but also the condition of your phone. You can even tell from the chart whether you are going to get your phone back. There are other uses for horary techniques as well, especially for event astrology. In fact, very recently, I did a YouTube video on the 2020 Singapore general election that correctly predicted the outcome of the election using horary techniques. So how often do I actually do horary questions? I really don't like trivial questions, and you'll find that most of the questions that come up with horary can be mischievous and ungenuine, especially as people sometimes feel like, let's ask a random question and just see whether this works. So in general, I really only do horary right now for private consultation clients, and only in genuine distress situations, particularly if it's a situation where I can't answer the question by any other astrological means. Relationship astrology. Some people think it's like, I'm a Capricorn, he's a Gemini, so are we compatible? And I assure you it doesn't work that way at all. And it's thanks to that kind of misconception that a lot of people think that astrology is for teenage girls to determine whether their crush is, compatible with them or not. Now, first of all, a professional astrologer typically works with a full natal chart. So simply saying that you are one sign or another isn't very helpful at all. So when we look at relationship astrology, there is a wide range of techniques that an astrologer might use. Now, first of all, I could look at just one person's chart to ascertain your relationship profile. We can also do things like house overlays, which is taking your chart and putting another person's chart over yours to see how you affect each other. We also have another technique called SYNASTRY, which is taking person A and person B and interlocking their charts together to see how you have an effect on each other. There is one more technique called COMPOSITE, where, for example, you could have a husband's chart and a wife's chart, and then they are recalculated to produce a third chart, and this third chart would be what we call the chart of the relationship. Now, you find that most people who are new to relationship astrology are very excited about trying out every single one of these techniques. But I've found that a really good carpenter does not need to use all the tools in the toolbox just to get the job done. And in fact, in actual practice, I've actually done some of my best relationship astrology work by giving people clarity about their expectations and needs in a relationship without actually having to look at another person's chart at all. You'll find most people tend to focus on the other person's chart to try and find out what their problem is. But you'll find most of the time the issues lie in our own charts. So how often do I actually use relationship astrology? Quite often actually, but almost never for a dating situation. In my practice, I tend to use relationship astrology techniques in a much more transformative way when I'm dealing with business partnerships, sometimes with married couples who are experiencing problems, and also with parent and child relationships. I find it very useful to first determine what the problem is before we start looking at charts, so that we're not just applying techniques needlessly and aimlessly. Elections, also commonly known as date selection. It is a form of astrology that sets a date for important events such as company incorporations, marriage solemnizations, or product launches. Now, unlike other forms of astrology, for Western astrologers, we really only need one important time for a specific event. Now, for example, in the case of a marriage, the only time that's important to a Western astrologer is the exact moment that a marriage contract is signed, because that's when a new entity is formed. So unlike other forms of astrology, we don't need multiple times and dates for, say, when's a good time for the bride to leave the house, or when's the good time for a wedding reception to begin. Elections are done so that the new entity matches the intentions of the people involved in it. For example, many companies have objectives beyond making profit when they start up. And you find also that married couples may have objectives beyond just buying a house and raising children. So you'll find a good election cements the intention of the people who are carrying it out. So how often do I actually do elections? Quite often actually, especially for marriages, company incorporations and product launches. Especially as most of my customers tend to be business owners. I've even done some elections for important surgeries. Now, that's an interesting one. Now, what I don't do elections for is births. I strongly believe that a soul has the right to choose their birth time and consequently to choose their birth chart. And I don't believe that an astrologer or even a parent has the right to decide that for another person. This is very different from adults who are electing a company incorporation or a marriage chart, because then you would be the one who has to carry it out. Profiling. You probably know this one already. And in fact, astrology is most commonly used as a profiling tool nowadays. I practice psychological astrology myself. And how this differs from every other kind of profiling tool is that it goes beyond just describing behaviors and needs, and in fact can uncover a lot of fascinating things, such as why some people have to write down every single expense in their lives, or why some people they're nice to everyone except their mother, or potentially why somebody could be a pathological liar. And I found that psychological astrology is very useful in uncovering some of these unexplainable behaviors and figuring out how people tick so that they can go ahead and make better decisions in their lives. So how often do I actually use profiling and psychological astrology? Well, the answer is every day. In every technique, every activity that I do in my astrological practice has got psychological astrology permeating into it, whether it's predictions or business astrology, because after all, astrology is about reading people. Astrocartography. Now, I call this world map astrology, and it looks like a world map with all these lines going across because it shows me where your planets would be had you been born in that particular place in the world. Astrocartography is very specific, and it's useful in very specific situations, such as if you were going to emigrate to another country, or perhaps if you have options to work in, say, Tokyo or Milan or Hong Kong. And astrocartography allows us to see what you might expect if you were to move your life into a different place in the world. Now, astrocartography is not useful if you are not the emigrating kind, or if you don't work anywhere else in the world. So for example, if you are a Singaporean, born in Singapore, raised in Singapore, and if you live and work in Singapore all your life, then astrocartography is not useful to you. Most of the time, we use it with business owners who have business interests in other countries, or potentially running very major events that occur in other countries as well. Some of the users can include, say, expats who have some choices as to whether they take up a position in Australia or in Hong Kong. So astrocartography helps them to make some good decisions. So how often do I actually use astrocartography? Quite often, actually, and increasingly as businesses go online, it becomes easier to target customers and audiences around the world. And in fact, so astrocartography helps me to guide business owners on how best to direct their marketing and their communication efforts. And that was 6 things you didn't know that professional Western astrologers actually do. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned on the Maysim channel for weekly episodes on practical, useful, and insightful astrology content.